The next 3 weeks will cover the relationship between free will and determinism. Now, to me, this is an interesting and important philosophical topic for several reasons. For one thing, free will is an interesting topic. Determinism is an interesting topic. The relationship between them is an interesting topic. These are things that philosophers care about, and a lot of other people too. The second reason that I like this topic is that there are a lot of interesting arguments. It's hard. It's something that, well, the arguments are more difficult than a lot of arguments. It's harder to see that an argument is bad, harder to see when an argument's working. But one of the most important reasons I like this topic is this is a topic that most people get exactly wrong. In fact, a good number of philosophers get this topic exactly wrong. It may be even a majority of philosophers get this topic exactly wrong. They get it exactly backwards. And if you would like some idea, to give you an idea of my mental state when I hear these people talking, imagine that you are in a coffee shop somewhere and you hear 2 people talking loudly behind you. And one of them says, "Do you believe people can produce cheese in Los Angeles?" And someone says, no, because I know the LA Lakers exist. Basketball is played in Los Angeles. And that's how I know there's no cheese there. Now, I want that to sink in. I want the bizarreness of that to sink in. I want you to think that there are beliefs in this world that are just as bizarre as the belief that the practice of basketball in a city makes cheese production impossible, or vice versa. That the production of cheese is incompatible with someone playing baseball. Now, that isn't the true depth of weirdness. That's a sort of intermediate weirdness. The real weirdness is someone saying, "Do you think people are going to be able to breathe at the top of Mount Everest? Or people are going to be able to breathe at the bottom of the Grand Canyon?" And someone says, "No, I know it is absolutely impossible for people to breathe in the Grand Canyon because I know that there is oxygen there. There's oxygen there, so no one will be able to breathe." That person, anyone who believed that, and I don't think anyone does, but if someone were to believe that, they would have the relationship between breathing and oxygen exactly backwards. You need oxygen to breathe. So if someone says, if you hear people say, someone says to me, "I believe in free will, so I don't believe in determinism," it's like saying, "I believe in breathing, therefore I don't believe in oxygen. I believe that I am able to breathe, therefore there is no oxygen in the air. I believe I have free will, therefore there is no determinism in my brain." It is actually logically the same. They're denying the necessity, they're denying the existence of something they actually need in order to do what they want to do, to have what they want to have. Okay, now, I bet at this point almost nobody in this room agrees with me, and that's perfectly fine. I'm betting at this point, unless you've already done some thinking about this on your own, you're all saying to yourselves, no, if it's determined, it can't be free. If there's oxygen, but to me that is like saying if there's oxygen, they can't breathe. in order to get to the right answer here, now, and if you're thinking that, you're agreeing with the author of our book. Donald Palmer thinks that if an action is determined, it can't be free. And he cites other authors who believe this. He doesn't really cite anyone who disagrees. Ted Honderich really doesn't disagree with that. Everyone cited in this book agrees with Palmer that free will and determinism are incompatible. Which is really weird to me because there are plenty of people who think the opposite, but none of them are mentioned in this book. So we are getting into an area, and this is another thing that makes it interesting, we're getting into an area where the text gets it wrong. This textbook gets the relationship between determinism and free will exactly wrong. And it leads Donald Palmer to say something that I think is pretty much the stupidest thing ever said in a philosophy textbook. And I invite you, in your reading of this book, to look out for that. He says something, it's not that he says something with which I disagree. That's okay, that's not stupid. It's not that he says something that I think isn't true. That's okay. He says something that logically cannot be true. If you go back, think back to Hume and relations of ideas and the idea of square circles and married bachelors, Donald Palmer says something that's like saying, so of course some bachelors are married, or so of course some squares are circles. And I invite you to look for this. I mean, if you don't notice it, that's fine. I didn't notice it the first time I read the book. I didn't notice it the second time I read the book. Just like the third time I went back and said, wait a moment, that cannot possibly be true. That is a logical contradiction. Yes, Eric?
Do you get extra credit if you find it?
Maybe, sure. Maybe I'll put it down as an extra credit question on the next quiz. Okay. So, now today I'm going to talk about determinism and predictability. I'm going to talk about what determinism is and what determinism is and what it isn't. Okay? Now, we start with Leucippus. Leucippus said, naught happens for nothing, but everything from a ground of necessity. You guys ever hear of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge? Up in Washington State. You ever hear about this bridge? It's quite famous, and there's probably video on YouTube. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was an engineering marvel. It was a single-span suspension bridge that was lighter than any. It was considered a wonderful achievement of engineering. It was a beautiful bridge. And then one day it got windy. The wind started blowing and kept blowing. And the bridge started out perfectly flat and level, started doing this. It's twisting. It was also twisting, but I can't make my arm twist like that apparently. Of course, everyone got off the bridge. No one went on the bridge, and there is film of the bridge doing this. The bridge is like wiggling, and then eventually it wiggles so much it breaks, comes apart, collapses. Now, did that just happen, or did it have a reason? It had a reason. Think of all the events of human history. Think of all the physical events. Oh, think of the tsunami. Did that just happen, or was there a reason? Think of the seafloor shift that caused the tsunami. A whole bunch of seafloor just went down. Did that just happen, or was there a reason? Wolf.
Are you saying there's no such thing as like freak events or anything like that?
Right. There's no such, nothing happens for nothing. That's what Leucippus is saying. Every time you see something happen, it didn't just happen out of nowhere. It happened for a reason. In other words, it was determined.
How did the very first reason start?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is quantum indeterminacy. You have to go to quantum indeterminacy, all right? Right now, all we have to do is assume there was an infinite causal chain. Infinity goes, causality is infinite in both directions. Let's put that question aside until we talk about quantum mechanics. Because in quantum mechanics, stuff does happen without a reason. And that's one of the things that makes quantum mechanics weird. But quantum mechanics does not affect things as big as the Tacoma-Narrows Bridge. In fact, it doesn't affect things as big as single atoms. Well, you'd have to work really hard to make it affect a single atom. So, what Leucippus said is basically everything happens for a reason. Everything happens because everything happens because the immediately preceding conditions made it necessary. Remember the tsunami? Remember the seafloor shift? Okay, immediately before the seafloor shift, immediately before that massive area of seafloor dropped, that seafloor was in a state of extreme tension that could only be relieved by the shift. Now that's determinism. Everything happens, determinism, or to put it another way, when an action is determined, when an event is determined, it happened because the immediately preceding conditions made it happen. And that's what determinism is. Now, the situation gets complicated when you reckon in quantum mechanics. And if you want to reckon in quantum mechanics, just remember quantum mechanical effects wash out when you get large structures. When I say large, I mean atoms. So quantum mechanical effects affect the locations of electrons, the paths of individual photons, but they do not affect atom-atom interactions unless someone has gone to a lot of trouble to get a macroscopic quantum mechanical effect. So the bottom line is, we can ignore quantum mechanics. So, everything happens because the immediately preceding conditions made it necessary. Leucippus did not know about quantum mechanics. He thought it was determinist all the way down. So, Tacoma Narrows Bridge fell down because the conditions when it was built were such that at a certain time it was going to become windy. A steady wind was coming. And although the designers of the bridge did not know this and probably could not even have predicted it if they'd thought about it, although the bridge designers didn't know it, the design they used determined that the bridge would react in a certain way to a steady wind. When the wind started blowing, it moved a little. Because it was of the way it was designed, because of its shape and its physical characteristics, that movement was reinforced. As long as the wind kept blowing, that movement would keep being reinforced, and energy would build up inside the bridge. The bridge would be started swinging like a pendulum. The bridge had a certain tensile strength. The strength of the bridge was fixed. It could take exactly so much stress and no more. If the wind had stopped blowing 1 second before the bridge collapsed, 1 second before the point of no return, the bridge would have been safe. The bridge would not have collapsed. But once the wind blew beyond that critical point, the bridge was doomed. If it had stopped 1 second late, the bridge would still have collapsed. There was a point between 2 seconds. On one side, the bridge is safe, it's not going to collapse, and then on the other side, there's too much energy, the bridge is going to overstress. That's how determinism works, that's how physics works, that's how material science works, that's how engineering works. Take this out here. Now, I'm going to talk about Laplace and the Holbach. Laplace was actually wrong. Laplace was brilliant, not just a brilliant mathematician, and his theory that we're going to give up here, I'm going to talk about here, is brilliant but wrong. Now, the reason I say that he's brilliantly wrong is that nobody ever thought of this before. This is an absolutely stunning idea that it took a genius. Basically, this is the kind of mistake that only a genius could make. You would have to be absolutely brilliant to make this kind of mistake. I would have to be. I am not smart enough to make this mistake. The interesting thing about it, the reason I'm bringing it up here, is it's important to think about why this is a mistake, where exactly Laplace goes wrong. if I knew the locations and vectors, and if every particle in the universe was such that I knew exactly where it was and exactly what it was doing at this instant of time, and I knew all the laws of nature exactly, then I'd be able to predict the entire future and infer the entire past. I could settle any historical question by looking at the locations of atoms now. So you think about any historical question you like, ask me, and I go out and look at all the atoms out there now and say, oh yeah, that happened, because if it hadn't happened, these atoms wouldn't be over here. Now, this statement is true, but it's a big if. This is why it's brilliantly wrong. We cannot predict the future. We cannot infer the past. You know why? Imagine writing down the locations and vectors of all the students in this room. Right? Lay out a seating chart with names, and then interview each student to say, find out what he or she is going to do immediately after leaving class. Imagine writing out the locations and vectors of all the bodies in the solar system. Tens of thousands of them, not counting the Oort cloud. Oh, and you had to count dust specks too. Little tiny bits of grit. Has the mind boggled yet? Okay, now, imagine describing the location of a single object exactly. My one memory from my one statistics class is of the professor holding up a ruler and saying, we can never know the exact length of this ruler. It's always an approximation, because there's always another number beyond, another place beyond the decimal point. Right. Everything is known to limited precision, and small differences can build up. We cannot know the location, we cannot know the vector of a single particle perfectly. We cannot have perfect knowledge of the location and vector of a single particle. We cannot know the location and vector of a baseball perfectly. We can only have an approximation. How much variance in the alignment between the baseball and the bat, between the ball and the bat, will make a significant change in the exit vector of the ball? You know, swing, hit. What if you hit just a little high? What's going to happen? It's going to hit the ground. Hit a little low, it'll go up too sharply. Do you never ever know exactly how the bat is going to hit? The best baseball players are the ones who can reduce the uncertainty to a very narrow range, so that most of their balls go where they're supposed to go where they need to go. Nobody has perfect control. Even machines cannot give you perfect control. They can give you very close to perfect. So that's why this is a big if. We can hardly begin to have enough information to do this. It's only in very extraordinary circumstances that we can make predictions. It's only in very extraordinary circumstances that we can infer the past. One of my favorite stories is just after the state of Israel was founded and started ingathering the Jews of the world. Basically, as far as if you are a Jew, if you are Jewish, you can go to Israel and they will accept you. It's in their constitution. They never turn away Jews. That's the part of a big part of the reason for the existence of Israel, is so that all the Jews have somewhere to go. This tribe of black people in Africa claimed to be Jews. They said, our tribe was founded by Jewish traders, people, Jews who came here in ancient times. And we're talking a couple of thousand years ago. We've always known we were Jewish. We want to go to Israel. And the Israelis said, you don't look Jewish. They did DNA tests. They're Jewish. They scanned the DNA of these people, and they turned out to be 100% right. They are Jewish. They have a lot of African genes too, but they're Jewish. So now they live in Israel. So now we know that their story is true, that Jewish people left ancient Israel, traveled to Africa, and intermarried with the local population, founding a Jewish tribe. Left that trace. Now, if we knew the whole world with that precision, we could verify or confirm or disconfirm all kinds of stories. But we can't. We don't have enough information. So, we don't even begin to have enough information for this. And that's why Laplace is wrong. Because determinism does not imply predictability. Basically, the more we know about something, the more predictable it's going to be. But we never know enough for perfect predictability. Does anyone here think that something like a bridge collapsed was random? Does anyone here think that something like the collapse of a bridge was undetermined? The bridges just collapsed for no reason. Remember, if you're saying that something was not determined, you're saying it happened for no reason. Biggest thing about determinism. Does the fact that it was determined mean that they could have predicted it ahead of time? Given the information available to them at the time. I'm not talking about magic prediction. I'm talking about, given the information they had at the time, could they have predicted it? Well, they spent millions of dollars on this thing. They hired engineers. The engineers wanted it to be safe. Engineers like things to be safe. Bureaucrats and politicians, not so much. Engineers like things to be safe. There's never had an engineer say, hey, let's spend less money on this. The engineers say, no, let's take a little longer, let's spend more money, let's make it safe. The collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was determined but not predictable. Determinism does not imply predictability. Determinism says that sometimes, well, basically, things can only be predictable if they're determined. If they're not determined, they're not predictable. But determinism does not imply predictability because predictability is a human capacity. I'll write that in green because I like green. Predictability is a human capacity that only exists with some relatively simple systems. Okay, let's say we're good at pool, you know, thing with the stick and the little round balls on the table. Let's say we're good at pool. Imagine that you are a really good pool player. And imagine that you are watching somebody else play pool, that he's trying to make a difficult shot, and that just before the cue strikes the ball, you know the shot's going to miss. Because you can see the angle of the cue and you know that angle is not right. You see that the angle of incidence is just not right, and that the ball's going to go, the cue ball's going to go to the right, and the target ball's going to go, so it's the 8 ball, and the 8 ball is going to go to the left, and it's not going to go in. Is that plausible? Is it plausible that someone could know the game of pool well enough to be able to make that prediction? Now, if people can make predictions like that, is it possible that they're predicting the behavior of a random system? Would we be able to play pool if pool balls were not deterministic? If they would behave randomly? So, let's say you're playing pool, and you find yourself trying with the balls amazingly, and this will never happen. This is a thought experiment. Just imagine it happens that you have a setup that is exactly the same as a setup you had 2 weeks ago. That is, the position of the cue ball is the same, the position of the 8 ball is the same relative to the table, right, relative to the shape of the room, whatever. You're playing in the same room, you've got the same stick on the same table, the same balls, and the balls you need to worry about are in exactly the same position they were before. And 2 weeks ago, you sank the shot perfectly and won the game. You sank the ball and you won the game. Now, are you going to try and do something different, or are you going to try to do exactly the same thing? Who would do something different? Last time hitting it this way made it go in, but that's not going to work today. That might not work today. My best chance of making the ball go in is to hit it the other way, or is to flip it out of the table, is to hit it not quite so hard, or to hit it harder. And remember, last time the ball went in perfectly. Not too fast, not too slow. No worries. Exactly the right shot. Are you going to try to do exactly the same thing again, or are you going to try and do something different? Hands up anyone would want to do it differently. Hands up anyone who says, well, I can do it exactly the same way, but it might not have the same result. Why wouldn't it have the same result? Do pool balls behave at random? They do. If you hit one exactly the same way, twice in a row, it's going to behave differently both times? No, yeah, that's it. It's going to be the same every time. Same conditions, same result. If it wasn't the case, if pool balls behaved randomly, say you put little weights on them so you couldn't determine how they're going to go, right? You gimmick the table, you gimmick the balls. No one's going to want to play pool. The game of pool depends on determinism. An indeterministic game of pool would be a waste of time. Winning would be a matter of complete luck. Determinism says if you set up exactly the same conditions, again, you will get exactly the same result. Same conditions, same result. So if you've had the same conditions before, you will have the same result. Now there's two kinds of predictability. I'll wait. I want to add something else here. Do you ever think about hitting a baseball? Think about hitting a pool ball, or kicking a soccer ball, or any other thing involving equipment, right? Physical. Is it ever a case that you hit a baseball with exactly the same conditions, with exactly the same bat, at exactly the same way, and it behaves differently. And I'm talking everything the same: air pressure, weather, your state of mind, your state of physical health. The ball hits the bat hits the ball the same way, you get the same result. Remember, I talked about Babe Ruth's cold shot, where he pointed his bat before he swung, and the very next ball he hit out of the park in that direction. Somehow he knew what the pitcher was going to throw, and he hit that ball exactly right to make it go over the park. He had predictability because he believed, at least, that he knew the conditions exactly, and he knew exactly what to do, and he knew himself. He knew that he was exactly in the right condition to do exactly what he had to do to hit that ball out of the park in that direction. I'm still amazed. That only works if determinism is true. If determinism wasn't true, Babe Ruth could not have predicted that. And if determinism wasn't true, baseball players could not be better. You could not have a worse and a better baseball player. You could not improve your conditions, because everybody would be up swinging, and it would be anyone's guess what would happen. You could not, if determinism is not true, you cannot be good at anything. Because being good about something is all about creating the right conditions to bring about the desired result. And the only way the right conditions can bring about the desired result is if conditions bring about results. And that's another way of saying determinism. Two kinds of predictability. There's easy predictability based on test runs. Let's say we put up another bridge in the Tacoma Narrows, exactly the same as the original Tacoma Narrows bridge. Given that weather conditions around there haven't changed, the Tacoma Narrows is still subjected to those long, steady winds. What's going to happen? You're going to have a bridge that wobbles itself to pieces. No question. Say there's a freak accident, like a meteor, takes out the San Francisco, well, the Bay Bridge. The last earthquake, the Bay Bridge partially collapsed. Now, if we build that bridge exactly the same way that it was, as long as there's not an earthquake, what's going to happen? Let's say you have a span you want to bridge under exactly the same conditions that you've already bridged successfully with another bridge. What are you going to do? Are you going to do something different, or are you going to do the same thing? Why do freeway bridges tend to look the same? You use a design that's worked before. This is how we know certain designs will work, because we've used them before. So that's predictability based on test runs. When you've never done something before, when you're trying to do something you've never done before, like build a bridge over the Tacoma Narrows, how easy is it to predict what will happen? The collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was impossible to predict. It was impossible to predict because the engineers who were doing it didn't know enough about harmonics. And the musicologists or the physicists who could have told them didn't know they were building this bridge. This was a communication problem. Nobody thought about resonance. Nobody was there to think about it. How many times has something happened to you and you look back and you say, wow, if I had thought about this ahead of time, I could have predicted it. But then you look back at your mental state before that and you think, well, wait a moment, I would never have thought of that. That is some obscure piece of knowledge, or that is something I didn't know. So, based on what we know beforehand, it is usually hard to predict what will happen. You make a test run and then set up the same conditions again, you know what's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen exactly the same way, that has to be because some of the initial conditions were different. This is why some of us are worse at sports, because we are not so good at setting up the same conditions. Right? Everyone who's ever played baseball has gotten a good hit. I think I even got a good hit once. Maybe I'm deluding myself. But let's say I got a good hit once. Does that make me a good baseball player? No, because I don't have any hope of recreating the same conditions. The good baseball players are the ones who can recreate exactly the right conditions to make the hits they want to hit. It's all about getting the bat moving at exactly the right direction, at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right momentum, to take advantage of physics where it hits the ball. And the only reason you can do that is because the laws of nature are deterministic. Newtonian physics. Okay, so the collapse of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was determined, but it was not predictable. I'm going to write out something very, very, very important, and this is something the book gets exactly backwards. Determinism does not mean predictability. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was a deterministic system, but it was not predictable. One thing we know about the baseball bat versus baseball system, it's deterministic. But we know that because we can predict what is going to happen. Any system where we can predict what is going to happen is deterministic. This is something we know for a fact. If something is predictable, it is determined. If someone goes to church on a regular basis, you really can predict that someone's going to go to church this Sunday, that implies that something in that person is deterministic. The church-going deciding system is deterministic, because you cannot get successful predictions without determinism. It is not logically possible. Where events are undetermined, they are unpredictable. This the book gets exactly wrong. Okay, in the last 10 minutes, I want to do some knots. Determinism is not predetermination. If you remember the black sox scandal, a group of baseball players got together because they were paid dirt. A group of baseball players got together and threw games for money. They predetermined that they wouldn't make certain catches, they wouldn't make certain hits. They predetermined, they determined before the fact. Determinism happens at the instant. It's not the conditions 5 minutes ago that determine something, it's the conditions right now that determines what happens now. Determinism is a Markovian process, which means it happens instant by instant by instant. So do it like this. The fact that some things are determined does not mean that they are predetermined. Predetermined means determined before the fact. Determined means determined at that instant. So don't tell me that determinism implies predetermination. It doesn't. Not predestined. Predestination is a doctrine out of religion that says whether or not you go to heaven or hell has already been decided before you were born. So whatever you do over your lifetime just confirms that where you're going. It doesn't determine where you're going. So predestination actually denies determinism. A deterministic theory of salvation would say what you do during your life determines whether you go to heaven or hell. A predestination theory of salvation says God has already decided whether you will go to heaven or hell. Nothing you do in your life can determine what happens to you after you die. And if you want to say what is it like if it's not determined, well, an indeterminist theory of salvation, a theory of salvation that denies determinism, would say that whether or not you go to heaven or hell is completely random. Nothing you do, nothing God does, nothing anybody does makes a darn bit of difference. It's the toss of a cosmic coin. It'll be a purely random. You might go to heaven, you might go to hell. Nothing you can do will affect the outcome. God can't control it. That is a theory of salvation that denies determinism. A deterministic theory of salvation says you can determine whether or not you go to heaven or hell. If you're mean to people and don't ever help anyone, welcome to hell. If you're nice to people and honest and sacrifice yourself for other people's happiness or behave honorably, well, on some theories that could determine that you go to heaven. So it's not predestination. Determinism denies predestination. It contradicts predestination. Let's see. I should make that. Determinism is not predetermination, it's not predestination. And finally, very important, determinism is not coercion. See these pens here? I'm going to pick one. I pick the blue one. Now, let us say that that was a deterministic process. Let's just assume that there was a deterministic process in my brain that at the instant I looked down, determined that I would pick up the blue one. Not saying I knew which one I would pick up, just that there was a process in my brain that determined I'd pick the blue one. Actually, I thought I was going to pick the green one, but in the end I picked the blue one. Let's say that was a deterministic process. Assuming it's a deterministic process, does that mean that someone came up here, took my hand, put it on the blue one, and forced my fingers around it? Does that mean that someone held a gun to my head and said, pick the blue one? Am I in chains with this puppets? Is anyone out there operating a mind control ray? No. A deterministic process happening inside my skull. If I say that some process that happens inside my skull is deterministic, that says nothing whatsoever about anything that happens outside my skull. It does not create coercion, and it is certainly very different from coercion. And I want you to be able to make a mental difference between a deterministic process happening inside your skull and somebody coming along and holding a gun to your head or twisting your arm or threatening you in some other way to make you do something. Determinism is not coercion. Yeah, cool. Determinism is not coercion. And this is a vital point that almost nobody remembers in this discussion. Okay, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. We'll pick this up.